Okay, well, I'm not going to introduce people. It's in the notes. I'm just going to jump right in. We're going to talk about DOGE. I know it's a boring topic. You probably haven't heard about it here in D.C., but it's a big deal out in the hinterland, so you better get educated. So, Judge, I want to start with you because you had this, had a couple of interesting articles. I want to start with one, more than a couple. You've had many interesting articles, but I'm going to start with one where you talked about how maybe the freak out over cutting all the spending is overblown given how much spending was going on in the prior administration.
Yeah, I think in the past couple of weeks, all of us have learned a lot more than we ever thought we wanted to know about impoundment, rescissions, deferrals, programmatic delays, and the whole panoply of different executive actions that can influence spending. I mean, one of the things that I think has gotten lost in the press caterwauling about the recent moves to pause spending on behalf of the Trump administration, DOGE's efforts to pause some spending, is that Biden had an unprecedented expansion of executive-driven spending. Like, this is not ancient history. By some independent estimates, you had Biden increase spending over a 10-year period by anywhere from $800 billion to $1.4 trillion. And for all of those who are now talking about the sacred power of the purse that resides only in Congress, I didn't hear the same sort of complaints when this happened just a year or two ago of, say, adding $180 billion to the food stamp program unilaterally, adding over $100 billion to the Medicare program, and obviously forgiving hundreds of billions of dollars of student loans even after the Supreme Court struck down Biden's more expansive plan. So we have this example of a president who was unilaterally expanding the budget deficits by hundreds of billions of dollars, and there was nary a peep from the press about this was an erosion of our constitutional separation of powers. There was nary a concern that this was a fundamental breakdown in Americans' system of congressionally led spending and congressionally led appropriations. Now, on the recent DOGE side, I think there's an open debate about some particular spending programs that may amount to an impoundment or may amount to something more than a pause. But there is a long bipartisan history of pausing spending to review these programs. We had Biden himself, who of course paused spending on the border wall and was upheld by the Government Accountability Office when they said, wait a second, this was a totally temporary delay. They're pausing it to review the program. This is what administrations do. We should understand that. Before there's much more hysteria in the press about what have amounted to temporary pauses, and it is hard to remember, but we're only a month into this administration, that this is something that's very typical, and only in a future scenario, I think, will we see something that looks much more like a long-term impoundment. At the least, I think we should all recognize the executive explosion during the Biden administration offers a wonderful opportunity for the Trump administration to corral spending merely by reversing a lot of the actions Biden took. Obviously, even the most dedicated believers in congressional primacy in these areas should admit, well, merely reducing Biden's executive actions should be returning much closer to the statutory baseline of spending than it was before Biden himself took office. So I think this has to be the baseline for any discussions about what Trump and DOGE can do, those unprecedented levels of executive spending on the behalf of the Biden administration that can be pulled back.
That's good. Okay. So, Brian, obviously you've done a lot of work on Medicaid, Medicare, and I want to ask you about, we'll start with Medicaid. What would DOGE tell us if it goes into Medicaid? I'm thinking about it like some kind of AI robot thing. It might be. We don't know. So what would it tell us if it went into the Medicaid system? What would it find?
Thanks. Let me start by building off of a point that Judge just made. If you look at CBO's Medicaid baseline from 2021 to 2024, it's about $650 billion higher in 2024 than it was in 2021. So there's been a huge surge of Medicaid spending through administrative action as well. I like to start talking about the need to reform Medicaid by saying there's been a huge expansion of the program over the last decade that has not improved Americans' health. So there's an enormous amount of spending through this program that is not doing us any good. Something that we are going to put out next week is the actual improper payments in the Medicaid program over the last decade. Only twice in the last decade has CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which oversees Medicare and Medicaid, done real audits of the Medicaid program. President Biden canceled them for many years, and President Biden canceled them because of COVID. Only in 2019 and 2020 did we actually do audits of the Medicaid program. In 1 year, the improper payment rate was 26%. In another year, it was 27%. If you take an improper payment rate in Medicaid of 25% and multiply it by federal Medicaid spending from 2014 to 2024, you get $1.3 trillion. So $1.3 trillion in improper spending in the Medicaid, just the Medicaid program over the past decade. We're trying to boil things down for lawmakers in two primary problems of the Medicaid program. So Medicaid, the federal government provides an open-ended reimbursement of state spending. So the more states spend, the more the federal government spends. One problem is that states don't have to come up with real expenditures. They can create expenditures on paper, and the federal government will match those expenditures on paper. We refer to that as Medicaid money laundering. I thought we had coined the term Medicaid money laundering at Paragon, and actually we were contacted by a reporter last week whether that was part of our framing, and it is, that's part of our framing. But in the course of our research, we found that the term was actually used by the Wall Street Journal in 2008 in a lead editorial to describe the way Medicaid is financed. So I did not create the term Medicaid money laundering, but I'm trying to make it great again. The federal government, so you have this open-ended reimbursement that's problematic. Obamacare created a new category of enrollees, able-bodied working age adults, and created a much higher federal reimbursement rate. So for the first 3 years of the expansion, it was 100%. So the complete cost of the expansion was borne by the federal government. And you could see what this did to incentives for states to classify enrollees as eligible under the expansion when the federal government reimbursed 100% of the cost. And this is when Obama canceled the eligibility reviews, why we didn't have measure improper payments during that period. That rate has phased down, it's now 90%. So the federal government's reimbursing 90% for able-bodied working age adults. On average, it reimburses about 60% for traditional Medicaid enrollees. So children on the program, people with disabilities on the program, seniors on the program, pregnant moms. Our first sort of main problem is that is federal discrimination against traditional enrollees. Congress should end the federal discrimination against traditional Medicaid recipients, against kids, pregnant women, people with disabilities, and seniors, and lower Obamacare's match rate until it reaches the match rate, the reimbursement rate that states receive for everybody else. So Paragon put out this Medicaid financing proposal last year. There's a bit more to it than that, but we think that reform will protect the program for those the program was meant to serve while leading to several hundreds of billions of dollars in savings for the federal government. The second big problem is the money laundering. So states create financing gimmicks. They do this in cahoots with providers in the state. It's actually, they call it a provider tax. It doesn't meet any definition that a sensible person, it really is it's a perversion of the word tax. These schemes are created by the providers often. They hire consultants. They then lobby the state governments to assess on them. And when they have them assessed, they lobby to increase the size of them. It's just a way to fleece the federal taxpayer and get more money coming in from Washington to help the state budget, as well as to provide additional funding for powerful political providers in the state and really benefit the insurers managing Medicaid. The sensible policy would not allow states to commit so much money laundering. The federal government permits it. They permit it within certain rules. And we think what they should do is, if reducing money laundering entirely is impossible, at least make it more difficult for states and providers to commit money laundering through the Medicaid program.
Okay, thanks. Now, Dan, some of your writing has been about how there was DOGE before DOGE, and not just the, hey, Biden had efficiency stuff, so we can too, but what do you mean?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. During an earlier panel, Jonah Goldberg talked about how the take on DOGE coming up with kind of a sophomoric view of discovering these problems, which have been long-standing. As someone who's worked in this area for a while, I spent 7 years working at the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, including a few years working for former Senator Tom Coburn. It is so refreshing for other people to be discovering these big problems. We are seeing GAO reports tweeted out to millions and millions of people. Stats around improper payments are becoming household terms that people understand. People have been looking at this for decades with few solutions actually moving to the center of this discussion. And we're at a unique moment in history where change around these major problems are possible. I know there's some skepticism when you mention waste, fraud, and abuse in conversations about fixing the federal budget and the big challenges we face. And to be clear, much bigger reforms are needed than reforms to stop waste, fraud, and abuse. But there are hundreds of billions of dollars of savings available simply doing good government reforms that have been recommended by groups like the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, by inspectors general. Together, there are about 19,000 open GAO and IG recommendations. Many of these changes are things that can be done in a bipartisan manner. A big problem is improper payments, as we've heard. Last year, GAO put out a report that looked at government-wide fraud, and the estimates ranged in the $230 to $520 billion range. There are things that can be done. The new administration's a month in. They haven't gotten there yet, but by enacting watchdog reforms, by modernizing some IT systems. At FreeOp, we put out a paper looking at how a digital identity could address a lot of the fraud that has been so prevalent and really increased during the pandemic. There's some good government reforms that could attract bipartisan support on the Hill to save a lot of money.
So OJ, State Financial Officers Foundation. So we talked some about DC. Tell us, what would a systematic DOGE kind of operation look like at the state level? How would you go about it?
So a wonderful question. First, again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. The first question really that we would ask at the state level is what is worth keeping? What is worth keeping within government? And of course, the answer to that obviously is what's constitutional, but let me approach it a different way. If any of you are like me, you may have a box or two at your house worth of stuff that you should probably throw out. But I haven't done that until yesterday when I saw my wife carrying that box of things that I wanted to keep, and she was on her way to the trash can. So it forced me to say, what is in this box that I actually want to keep? What is actually good in here? And I found some pretty important things. I found a couple of tax documents. Those are important to keep. But I also found a keepsake. It was a journal from my father, who's since passed, before my wife and I got married and before we had kids. And it was a journal of what it meant to be a father. And it was full of scripture and full of his musings and comments from about 20 plus years ago. That was something that was exceptional that I otherwise wouldn't have seen. To me, that's worth keeping. Even if you go through a difficult process like DOGE and some things are on their way to get thrown out that you think are worth keeping, it's a forcing mechanism to know exactly what's worth keeping. This is what's beneficial with the DOGE project that's happening at the federal level, and it is the essential question that we would ask at the state level: what is worth keeping in government? And for us, at the State Financial Officers Foundation, we work with our financial officers all across the country to promote sound fiscal public policy, which looks a lot like answering this question. We would say we've been doing DOGE before it was cool. Our auditors, our treasurers, all across the country have this specific responsibility. In Nebraska, the auditor and the treasurer there, they've been working on a DOGE project for the last 2 years, rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse within government. We've seen it in Kentucky at the same level. We've also seen it in Mississippi, particularly with the auditor there rooting out DEI at higher education levels. These things are important because they reduce the fat in government, they trim things down, enforce governments to actually decide what is important. And at the state level, there's a lot more you can do if you have less fat. You can be lean, you can resolve people's problems that are government specific a lot easier, but most importantly, you can give those dollars back to the people so they can spend that money the way that they want to. They can spend it on goods and services. They can spend it paying bills. They can spend it because they received a tax cut or a tax credit for other things. And most importantly, if you have less government spending, then you reduce inflation, which increases the value of the dollar in your pocket, which allows you to have a better life and lead to human flourishing. So these things are all connected, and if we can do it at the federal level, that we can continue doing it at the state level, state by state, which can lead to some pretty phenomenal outcomes.
So, OJ, I want to stick with you for a second. Both Judge and Brian mentioned executive actions that drive costs. And you and I talked before we came in here, my bailiwick, my issue is, unauthorized federal guidance that drives costs for state and communities. And we talked in particular about, and this is a CMS thing, Brian, CMS guidance going out to every state Medicaid office saying, well, you need to have a translator ready for, the top 15 languages in your state. And you need to make sure that nobody's waiting on the phone when they call you for longer than 7 minutes, or you might be violating federal law, even though I can't get anybody at my credit card company to get on the phone with me for at least 20 minutes. So what we talked about was the possibility that, the wicked witch is dead, the regime has changed, but all those things, all those pieces of paper that went out into the states are now lodged in state policy and practice. And so what does that look like?
Yeah, a couple things. First, I do think it is important, obviously, if you are a private business, if you're serving people, that you can do your job as well as possible. So if you can have somebody waiting on the phone for less than 20 minutes, less than 7 minutes, those things are good. But when you write it into policy, here's what happens, because I worked in the private sector on this side. Effectively, the companies that are responding to the request for proposal, they just build all that into their cost in their response. So if you have to have 15 different language translators, those costs are now built into that proposal. If you have to make sure that your technology or your call center services meet a certain threshold, again, in some instances that can be good, but you build that into the cost of your proposal. So now for the state, what could have cost $5 million, we'll just give a round number, a year for a proposal that would have delivered a good quality product, now costs $7 million, because you have to have those extra costs built in. And of course, that is paid for by you, the taxpayer. So as a result, you now have less money within the state to do the work that you're responsible for doing. And in some states, your taxes will go up to provide a product that hasn't changed at all in terms of what it can actually do. So this becomes a real cost that if you add these things in from the previous administration, these different rules, these different policies, that can increase things. So again, when you're looking at the whole project of DOGE, as it looks at how to perform government better, reforming some of these regulations is also something that we care about, because it can reduce the cost in a pretty significant way as well.
Brian, did you want to say something?
I would love to say something about the federal-state relationship here. So I agree completely. In order to have conservative governance, you need to have a budget constraint, and you need to evaluate priorities about what is worth spending money on, what's not worth spending money on, and how you're going to balance that with collecting revenue. To bring it back to what I talked about with Medicaid, historically, the federal government paid about 60% of the costs of Medicaid. Now the federal government's paying closer to 75% of the costs of the Medicaid program. If you look at it as a percentage of GDP, the percentage of GDP going to Medicaid that is borne by the state has been flat over the past 15 years, while it's significantly increased for the federal government. Part of that is the Obamacare Medicaid expansion and the incentives that face states, but part of it is that states are balancing their budgets and taking fiscal policy. Whenever they have budgetary problems, they're looking at how much money they can bring into the state through Medicaid to balance the state budget. Indiana is dealing with I think $1 billion budget shortfall now, and they have three options: increase taxes, cut spending, or transfer the bill to the federal government by increasing money laundering. What's in the incentive of the political apparatus in the state of Indiana? Well, they're going to look at what they can do through money laundering to pass the costs off to taxpayers in other states. And when all states have these same incentives, you have a massive collective action problem. And that's one of the reasons for conservatives, I think. I mean, there's a lot of talk about extending the Trump tax cuts, and I think that's really important. But in terms of reforming entitlements, what we can do on Medicaid this year is as important as anything to try to right-size the relationship between the federal government and the states.
So Brian, real quick, you said it a minute ago, quantify that. What's the total estimated take from the Medicaid money laundering?
So what I said is if you take the 25% improper payment rate across federal Medicaid spending over the last decade, that's $1.3 trillion. Medicaid money laundering, an estimate from the Congressional Budget Office says if you eliminate the provider tax, one of the financing gimmicks, you would save $700 billion. And that's just one of several financing gimmicks.
So a judge has a comment about what you just said, and then Dan, I know you want to jump into.
Yeah, one of the things I've spent a lot of time focusing on recently is how the federal government kind of acts as an unnecessary middleman in so many of these programs and issues. So I recently just wrote a very short piece about, in recent years, about a fourth of all state spending, state revenues, have come from grants from the federal government, over $1 trillion a year. And we understand that, there's transfers in between states, but mainly that money is coming from state taxpayers themselves, going up into Washington, D.C., being given back to the state after a cut off the top for the federal bureaucracy, and then given to them in a manner that's more restricted than those state taxpayers originally wanted to spend it. This is an absolutely insane process. I talked to a Michigan Department of Transportation officer who says, why am I doing this? I'm sending my money up to D.C. and they're giving it right back to me with a bunch of conditions that I didn't want, minus 5% for their bureaucracy. I did a recent report looking at just all kind of federal and state welfare programs and looking at the very fact that a lot of people who receive welfare programs, food stamps, Medicaid, et cetera, are also paying payroll tax. They're paying state income tax. They're paying a lot of taxes at the same time. And I was trying to estimate how much of our welfare state, our transfer state, is actually just returning people's own money back to them that they already paid to the federal government. Looking at the American Community Survey and some of these databases, I estimated it was around 20%. We're guessing around $800, $900 billion a year, depending on the exact year, of the entire American welfare state is just giving somebody money back to them that they already paid in D.C., that the D.C. got cut off the top for the bureaucracy, and then handed back to them in a form they didn't want it, such as food stamps or Medicaid, when they were actually giving that amount of their own money to the taxpayer. Both the grants of the states and these individuals, this is an entirely unnecessary middleman. Whether or not you qualify that as waste, fraud, abuse seems kind of unnecessary to me. There's an easy argument to make that we can cut out the middleman out of trillions of dollars of spending and make everybody's lives a lot easier without actually hurting the actual budget of almost anybody.
All right, so Dan, what do you want to say?
Just on this point that was raised a few minutes ago about regulatory reform, I think another reason to be excited about what's happening right now with DOGE and the new administration is their focus on conducting a really broad and extensive regulatory review. There was an executive order announced last week looking at a comprehensive review of existing regulations, and when you consider that that's following the landmark Supreme Court decision last summer narrowing Chevron deference and really limiting the power of the administrative state to use that authority to do policy making through regulations, we're at this unique moment where you could really streamline a lot of the red tape that's been built up in Washington. And also at the state level, back in December, I highlighted in a piece for City Journal a really promising model that was used in Ohio to use artificial intelligence to conduct retrospective regulatory review. You basically using large language models, looking at code, and some of the terms are from the 1800s that no longer apply, but they're still there in state code. The Ohio Lieutenant Governor's Office and the state legislature worked together to strip out about a third of the words in the state's code. When you think about how that model could be applied by DOGE and by OMB when their full team gets in place at OIRA to federal regulations and policymaking guidance, you could narrow substantially the administrative burden that's imposed by Washington.
So I'll note, we're going to keep talking, but we're going to do Q&A, and so if you feel the spirit move and you want to go ahead and start queuing, that gives us a sense of when to stop for Q&A. So you might have to stand for a minute, but it helps us, gives us more information.
Remember, the quicker you stand, the quicker I stop talking. So if you didn't have an incentive before, now you have an incentive to go up there.
Yeah.
I want to quickly add to that
Yeah.
a practical perspective, because where you can see this, the regulatory regime in trimming that a little bit is within higher education and student loans. I wrote an article, I think about 7 years ago or so, about how you can really shift a lot of the student loan authority back to states. Kentucky, for example, has the Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority and the Kentucky Higher Education Student Loan Corporation. Effectively, it is a state-level agency that has the power to issue student loans. Now, the reason why this is so effective is because Kentuckians and Kentucky understands what's needed in the state in terms of opportunities and careers. We have a tremendous, I say we because I'm from Kentucky, we have a tremendous nursing shortage in the state, particularly in rural areas. Same thing with doctors. So there's an opportunity to entice people to come to Kentucky by saying, if you want to study nursing, medicine, and so on, we can give you a loan at this particular rate that you'll pay back, and if you go work in underserved areas, particularly again if it's rural or even in an urban capacity, then over a period of time, 10 years or what have you, you stay as a resident, then you could have some of those loans forgiven. Now, I want to offer this not to say that this is a prescription for every single state, but this is what you can have in terms of innovation because it answers a few questions that, again, that are bipartisan. One, you have the federalism question. Again, what's important to keep at government and at what level with regard to student loans and education? It responds to job opportunities that are incredibly valuable and important for the health of our rural citizens, which are often forgotten. But again, as was said earlier, we don't forget those folks. And it responds to the other question about what to do with student loans that become too expensive. So there are a number of different ways that states can innovate and be a laboratory for democracy, again, as they were always intended to be.
That's good. You've been waiting patiently. Let's.
Dan Mitchell, you mentioned that Biden used executive orders to increase food stamp spending, Medicaid spending, student loans. Do you have all that in like one article? And then, just so there's a number that I can credibly use. But then secondly, is Trump going to reverse these things, or why hasn't he already? And then I suppose if I can ask a second question while I'm up here for the Medicaid folks, if I remember correctly, back in the good old days of Paul Ryan and entitlement reform, Republicans just wanted to block grant Medicaid to the states. Have we given up on that? Thank you.
Yeah, on this, the spending, executive spending, I had an article in City Journal, just Biden's executive spending was out of control. Just going to the background of that, I used a lot of numbers from Paragon, I would highly encourage you to look at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, which did a lot of these numbers going piece by piece through the individual executive spending actions. And yeah, a lot of these things happened sub rosa, didn't hit the press, but in retrospect, these are absolutely astounding. Again, if I recall correctly, the food stamps was $180 billion in increased charges at the stroke of a pen. Like, this is an amazing usurpation of Congress's authority, and nobody complained about it at the time. Trump is obviously looking at withdrawing some of these, and there's a debate about how the best way to go about that will be. Some of these will take time. Some of these are already embodied in the executive orders that went out. Some of these are going to require changes in the bureaucracy. And if I could just very quickly mention something else, I should, because a lot of the DOGE discussion has been around the civil service, about firings, dismissals, the president's authority around that. I have a report coming out next week that looks, again, at the states, which I think often offer great models and do their job as laboratories of democracy. The reforms at the state level of civil service are miles further than anything we've talked about at the federal level. It is really wild when people think about it. People talk about even Schedule F, or the career policy schedule that Trump instituted. Say, maybe 2% of the federal bureaucracy should have at-will employment. States like Georgia, Texas, Kansas, Arizona, it's the vast majority of employees are at will. You can fire them whenever without any particular change. And by all reports, this is working great. This was bipartisan reforms. We don't have the politicization options here. So I think Trump is moving that direction. A lot of what is going to have to be reversed is going to have to require some change in the bureaucracy first to make sure they are willing to go through with that. I think we saw in the first term there was a lot of open stonewalling about that. But this term, I think they're ready to do it. And frankly, I've been pretty impressed how the acting officials in most of these positions have been carrying out the new administration's orders. They say, here's what we're going to do, and most of the time, even if it was a civil service that was appointed to an acting position, they're saying, okay, we're going to cut spending here, we're going to cut back the grants there. And I think with more change to the civil service, we'll go even further.
So at the risk of starting a beef with a prior panel, which I want to do, thank you for bringing up state efficiency, because it's possible that maybe states and localities actually do things a lot better than the federal government when you go from an N of 2 to a larger sample. All right, Brian, what's your answer to the Medicaid
So the question is, have conservatives abandoned Medicaid block grants? And it's a tough question for me because I wrote my first paper when I was applying for a job at the Heritage Foundation in 2010 on my #1 policy reform was that we need Medicaid block grants. But I think the political realities of the moment make block granting Medicaid very difficult. A block grant is the best policy reform for Medicaid because it completely realigns the incentives so that states would move away from just maximizing federal dollars to getting a capped amount of money, and then anything above that, they would just be spending with state dollars, so they would have an incentive to get $1 worth of benefit for $1 cost, versus the incentive today to get 25 cents of benefit for $1 cost. When we sort of thought at Paragon how we were going to approach Medicaid going into this year, thinking we might have a reconciliation opportunity, we really honed in on these two areas that I talked about. Ending the federal discrimination against the most vulnerable, saying it makes no sense to pay 90% for able-bodied working age adults on the program and much lower rates for kids and people with disabilities, realizing that one of the main political challenges with Medicaid reform are the advocacy groups or those claiming to support children and people with disabilities. This reform would actually make the program better for them. And then just go after the Medicaid money laundering. When you explain how the money laundering works in the Medicaid program to the average member of Congress, they're pretty shocked and surprised that we allow Medicaid financing to work this way. And we have some great quotes that we give them. Like we quote President Biden when he was vice president, calling Medicaid provider taxes a scam that should be eliminated. And we quote from President Obama budgets that proposed limiting the provider tax schemes. So I think that's, given where we are politically with a 2-seat majority, a Republican majority in the House, those two reforms, I think, are the furthest that we can conceivably get. And it's going to be hard to get those two reforms. But they'd be big reforms.
Dan, did you have something?
I would just add that I think that so far I think there's a really optimistic take on how DOGE is approaching the issue of government waste, reg reform, and broadly the Trump administration. Where I think they have a big opportunity is to begin working with Capitol Hill and working with Congress. Back in the fall, one of the issues that was brought up around DOGE was expired programs. These are the programs that have lapsed authorizations. CBO puts out a report every year, and there's about $500 billion are spent on these programs. And no one is saying that these programs are going to be ended. These are things like the VA, the State Department. But Congress has really neglected the opportunity. It's authorizing responsibilities. So this is difficult work. This takes compromise. It takes looking at programs and making these difficult decisions. But for these changes to be lasting, to exist beyond the current administration, there'll need to be some significant changes in law made. And while they have this political capital, it would be very valuable for the Trump administration to work with Congress on those needed reforms.
Yes, Vance Gann, President of Gann Economic Consulting. Thank you for being here and doing this. I had a piece out today, Let States Lead the Way on Welfare Reform at American Institute for Economic Research. Check that out, which talks about a lot of these things too. Going back to your point though, Dan, on how do we get Congress to act on these? Because I'm concerned that DOGE is going to come up and expose a whole bunch of stuff that should be eliminated. A lot of states are doing this too. I work with a lot of states across the country. They're forming their own DOGEs to find waste, fraud, and abuse and everything else. But at the end of the day, there's only so much the executive branch can do, or I think that they should do. At the end of the day, it should be up to Congress to act, to really start to make these cuts permanent. So I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
I completely agree with you, and I think there's no easy answer to that. I think that the fact that they have not taken that opportunity is telling, often because it requires making difficult compromises to move through the legislative process. I think there are things that can be done through appropriations. There's things that are a small ball of reporting requirements, creating greater transparency. For over the past 5 years, I've been really encouraged that Congress has been requiring transparency about what could be saved through enacting watchdog recommendations. Some of these reforms were led by a Democratic congressman from Washington. But really, anyone in this room, if you're involved in the business of talking to policymakers, we should be urging Congress to step up and start reforming these programs that are so outdated and that haven't been looked at for decades. Head Start, ESCA, IDEA, big education programs that govern $30 billion in spending or more haven't been changed since the early 2000s. We need to move these programs off autopilot and reflect current realities. And it's going to take some hard work, but that's why members of Congress were sent to Washington. And I think there are a lot of members that are in the business of wanting to go on cable news and to be engaged in the pundit world, but I think there's some really frustrated lawmakers who are sad that they're not taking votes, they're not doing the legislating that they had hoped for.
Brian, what's your comment?
So in my view, it's harder for Congress because they're more captured by the special interests than the executive branch. I do think what the executive branch could do is propose rules. And if they propose rules and then you get the cover from the president and the administration, Congress can come in and codify those proposed rules. And if there's budgetary savings, they'll be able to capture half of the savings that then they could apply to, say, an extension of tax cuts.
I think, too, quickly just to add to that, this is the benefit, I think, of the strategy that Musk and his group are proposing. If they come in and act as consultants and they point out, well, here's the $50 billion we're sending around the world for these things that are completely against American interests, then we're able to gain credibility as a government. So then the legislature, the Congress, they're able to say, well, cutting is actually pretty popular. So then there's real credibility that allows Congress to make these difficult decisions because the American people have seen how much waste is there.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Victoria. I'm a reporter with Upward News, and my question piggybacks off a point that Dan made earlier about just these sheer numbers that policymakers in Washington have been tracking for decades, now kind of being thrust into the ether with the likes of Musk and DOGE. I think this has brought a lot of attention from the general public into actually what goes on in Washington, particularly in the budgetary process. But my question is, what do you think are the most common misconceptions just about the budgetary process, what actually can be cut? You know, I actually just came from the AFP event with Speaker Johnson. He was talking about the reconciliation process. Obviously, with that, you have a lot of spending that is already predetermined. And so when you look at making cuts, it seems like those areas are very small to the general public.
I would agree with you and say that I think that there's limited flexibility for the administration and the executive branch to unilaterally end spending. It takes Congress to get in the game through the authorizing process, through the appropriations process to make these changes. And that may, I know reconciliation is an exception, but it'll involve some compromise if we're looking at 60 votes in the Senate, and that's difficult work. It's requiring lawmakers to do the job that they were sent here, but it can't be done unilaterally by the executive branch. There's a lot they can do, but cutting spending and the changes that are desperately needed can't be done on their own accord.
Did you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Tess Weldon, founder and CEO of Touchpoint Strategy. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm based in London. And as part of my work, I previously pushed a bill through the UK Parliament that devolved power to Yorkshire, which is a large county in the UK. It's kind of our equivalent of your state, apart from we're tiny. However, projects like that in the UK are really rare because we have a large amount of political apathy among our people, and a lot of our politicians are bought by interests that obviously don't want any kind of streamlining in government. What do you think the US has to teach its neighbors and allies about actually galvanizing support for a DOGE-like program?
It's a great question for someone else up
Thanks.
here. Judge, you have a booming voice.
That'll substitute for
Yeah,
intelligence
I'll
for
believe
a few
you.
moments. I'll take that one, but thank you. I mean, on the devolution issue, I think it is interesting, and we all have been particularly celebrating this issue of the power of the states and local governments to do something. America, despite the overweening influence of the federal government and its growing influence, is fairly unique in the developed world in the extent of its devolution. If you look at the amount of taxes and revenue raised at the local level, the only other country that really competes with us is Switzerland, which is obviously, they have their long history of cantons and their whole country is relatively small. So devolution there looks pretty minor. You know, we have a 330 million person country. And yet, by some measures, we have the highest level of taxes raised by these local governments that can be as small as a few hundred people or as big as New York City and 8 million. I mean, one of the things I do often tell people is that with a 330 million person country, there is no way we're going to come to an agreement on a massive number of public policy issues. But luckily, we have an arena in which we can resolve that, and that people can live in different sort of policy environments and carry out the policies that they think are best. And there is a long literature on devolution in local government that shows that those areas that have more devolution and more power in the local government tend to have smaller and more efficient government. There's just a bunch of great studies that look, well, when you have more competing local governments, because say there's a river through, and that allows governments to form on each side of the river, they're both more competitive in terms of they get a better bang for their taxpayer dollars than areas with a large centralized, even local government, and they tend to spend less. They tend to be closer to what they call the median voter in the political science literature. If the median voter tends to want more spending, less spending, the smaller local government is more likely to achieve that. There's a term in the political science literature called the flypaper effect. And then with all these grants that we have from the federal government, they give them to some state or local government. If the government is acting in an efficient manner, it's answering to their taxpayers, they should mainly just filter that back down. They were already taxing and spending at the level that those voters wanted, so a grant shouldn't really increase the total amount of government spending. But one truth we've learned about the flypaper effect is the bigger the government, the more likely that grant is to stick to the government itself and not filter back down to the taxpayers. And so if we can get more of those governments, those smaller governments, to answer these questions, take care of these issues, not do that roundabout middleman path into DC, we're going to have a lot more efficient government, and that's going to be, I think, in the long term, one of the best ways to answer these issues.
And an efficient government leads to better services for the people. And I'll end my comments with this. Again, what is worth keeping and what is worth doing for government? If you cut government spending away from something it shouldn't be spent on, then you have more money to pay a member of law enforcement who goes out there and puts their life on the line every single day to keep our communities safer. Less government spending leads to more safety if you do it that way. If you create the opportunity for dollars to follow parents and kids in the school of their choice because you've cut it away from things that don't matter to education, which does, that you've created the opportunity for kids to get a better education, for teachers to be held accountable, and to get the benefits of doing their job well. You can actually improve roads. You can improve bridges in rural communities across your state or across the country because you have money being spent where it ought to be spent if it's not. More efficient government leads to human flourishing in a way that allows individuals and communities to thrive, to be safe, and to have economic prosperity. That's the real benefit of making sure that you have an efficient government, and sticking to those principles, I think, could work here in the United States, but also in the UK and for our friends all across the world.
Well, in the interest of efficiency, we have to end on time. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, distinguished panelists, and you can corral them off stage if you got more questions for them. Thank you.